Let's jump right in. Today, we're digging into a really unsettling explainer. We're doing a forensic breakdown of a chronological phenomenon, a case study known as the shadow at 213. And what makes this anomaly so fascinating and honestly pretty terrifying isn't just the unexplained terror itself. It's the absolutely rigid, almost mathematical escalation driven by what we're going to call the rule of proximity. We're going to break down exactly how a distant curiosity systematically forces itself into a very immediate, unavoidable reality.
So, tell me if this sounds familiar. Have you ever just snapped awake in the dead of night for absolutely no reason? Your eyes pop open, the house is totally quiet, and you just feel entirely alert? Well, keep this very specific timestamp in your head, 2:13 a.m. Because in our case study, this isn't just a random middle-of-the-night occurrence. This exact minute serves as the trigger point for every single event that follows. It's literally the central pillar of the entire phenomenon. Every single night, like clockwork, the sequence initiates at exactly 2:13.
To really grasp how this escalates, we first have to establish the baseline of night one. Picture an incredibly ordinary, quiet rental house just outside Portland. You've got soft rain falling, a little distant thunder, and a bedroom lit by nothing but the glowing red numbers of a digital clock. But the very first true sign of an anomaly actually comes from the dog, Max. He doesn't bark, he just gives this really low, deep, continuous growl. And outside the window, standing across the street, is a tall, perfectly motionless silhouette. It's only illuminated for a split second by a flash of lightning, but it's facing directly toward the bedroom. That is day zero. Now, let's look at the core terror of this case, which is the methodical escalation. On night one, the figure is safely across the street, right? But by night two, it's crossed the road. It's standing in the neighbor's front yard. By night four, it is literally at the edge of the narrator's own yard. This isn't just random wandering around. It's a highly deliberate closing of the distance. It is systematically shrinking the safe zone around the subject night after night.
And that deliberate approach highlights just how deeply unnatural this entity really is. On night two, the narrator actually calls the police. The responding officer searches the street, checks the yards, knocks on doors, and finds absolutely nothing. But before leaving, the officer asks a really chilling question. He says, "Did you actually see the person move?" And the answer is no. This absolute statue-like motionlessness makes the whole case incredibly eerie. It arrives, it stands completely static, and then it just vanishes.
Now, if this were just a trick of the light, it would all end at sunrise, but it doesn't. The terror bleeds right into the daytime. The narrator starts finding barefoot footprints in the mud right by the fence, along with these inexplicable deep scratches near the back door. And maybe the biggest red flag? Max outright refuses to go outside after dark. Whatever is showing up at 2:13 a.m. is leaving a very real, tangible, physical footprint in the real world.
So we get to night four, and the distance has closed enough to finally gather a visual profile. The entity is described as tall, extremely thin, and wearing dark clothes. Its arms hang down unnaturally low, and its head is tilted sideways, almost like it's studying the house, or studying the narrator. And the most chilling part of that night, when the narrator hits it with a flashlight beam, the entity doesn't blink, it doesn't flinch, the light just flickers, and the figure slowly raises an arm and points directly back at the narrator. The observer has officially become the observed.
Naturally, trying to regain some kind of control, the narrator installs security cameras and locks the place down tight. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the front door camera triggers a motion alert. The figure is now at the very end of the driveway. That is the closest it has ever been. But look at the technical anomaly here. The camera feed severely distorts with heavy static interference. It's almost as if the digital sensor itself literally cannot process the entity's presence. And right through that static, the entity tilts its head up to the lens, and you can see a huge, pale grin stretching unnaturally wide. And there are absolutely no visible eyes.
Well, the digital defense totally fails, and we experience the first physical breach. While staring at that grinning figure on the camera feed, the narrator suddenly hears Max start barking violently downstairs. Then the dog lets out this really sharp yelp, and then complete silence. The narrator grabs a kitchen knife, rushes downstairs, and finds the living room completely empty. But the back door, which was absolutely locked, is standing wide open, with a freezing cold wind blowing right into the house. The perimeter has been compromised.
Let's stop and compare the evidence at this specific breach point. Logically, the narrator expected to look outside that open door and find canine paw prints, right?
from their missing dog Max. But instead, the tracks leading away from the house and into the dark, muddy woods weren't dog tracks at all. They were human footprints, barefoot. The exact same prints that had been escalating around the fence line for the past few days. Max didn't just run off, he was taken into the woods by whatever left those tracks.
And that brings us to the climax of this case study, the final night. The narrator is just completely driven by a desperate need to understand what this thing actually wants, so they decide to stay. They sit waiting in the absolute dark, armed with that kitchen knife, just watching the front yard. The clock ticks right to 2:13 a.m., and nothing happens. The yard is completely empty. The clock ticks over to 2:14 a.m., and for just a fleeting second, the narrator feels this massive wave of false relief, thinking the pattern has finally broken.
But the pattern didn't break. The entity just bypassed the outside entirely. That quiet is suddenly shattered by 3 heavy knocks coming from inside the upstairs floor. Then there's another knock, and this one is right at the open bedroom door. Moving upstairs in the pitch black, the narrator watches their own rocking chair moving back and forth, completely by itself. Creak, creak, creak. And finally, the sound of breathing manifests directly right next to their ear. The proximity is now 0. And right then, the entity speaks. A whispered voice, directly in the narrator's ear, says, "You finally let me in." I really want you to sit with that quote for a second. The psychological horror of that is immense. The entity is implying consent. It's implying that by engaging with it, by waiting for it in the dark, by unlocking that door of curiosity, the narrator effectively invited it inside. The physical locks on the doors didn't matter at all because the mental barrier had already been dropped.
Turning around, the narrator is faced with the final visual profile. The figure is standing mere inches away. Its skin is a pale, deathly gray. That impossibly wide grin is right there in front of them. And where the eyes should be, it's just complete, empty, pitch-black darkness. The sheer sensory overload of this horrific, impossible proximity is just too much, and the narrator experiences a total blackout, losing consciousness right at the bottom of the stairs. The aftermath of all this really forces us to weigh 2 completely competing narratives. The police attempt a pretty standard rationalization. They find the narrator unconscious by the stairs, there's no sign of forced entry, so they conclude that this was just a severe hallucination brought on by intense stress and sleep deprivation. But that theory completely ignores the physical reality of the situation. Max the dog is still missing. The barefoot, muddy footprints outside were real. The deep scratches carved into the back door are real. The physical evidence completely shatters that neat psychological rationalization.
Which brings us to a deeply chilling epilogue. The source text reveals that the narrator wisely packed up, moved out of that house, and relocated to a brand new apartment. They tried to break the cycle, but the phenomenon is an unending loop. Because at the new apartment, every single night at exactly 2:13 a.m., the motion detection alerts have started going off again. And when that camera feed is checked, there is someone standing outside. And just like before, night by night, they are getting closer.
We've tracked the timeline, we've examined the physical evidence, and we've seen exactly how this rule of proximity systematically breaks down every single physical and psychological defense. The pattern is resetting itself right now. So I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider as we wrap up this explainer. Knowing the methodical escalation, knowing the physical evidence it leaves behind, and knowing exactly what waits in the dark at 2:13 a.m., if you heard that knock from inside your own house, would you open the door?